Things fall apart. What a negative title for a sermon. Things fall apart. That name, that word, those words together, things fall apart, is actually the name of a book. It's the name of a famous Nigerian novel published in 1958 about the effects of colonialism on Nigerian culture. And I've always thought it's one of the great book titles in history. I just love that title. And it's actually borrowed from a phrase from the poet W.B. Yeats in his 1919 poem, which was entitled The Second Coming. The Second Coming. And it was about his reflections about the fact that World War I had decimated Europe. And now there was a pandemic that had broken out that was killing a third of the world's population. It was the 1918-1919 flu. Many people died, but his wife almost died and survived. But it was that line where we got the words, things fall apart. And it's also where we got the words and the phrase, the center cannot hold. The center cannot hold. Maybe this sounds familiar, these two negative phrases, when you watch the news today. When you watch the news around the world, you see war, you see the drums of war, we experienced a global pandemic, and there is a feeling of things falling apart and the center cannot hold. Now that would have been a good name for the book of Ecclesiastes, because this piece of wisdom literature that we find in the Bible, in the Old Testament, is telling us that on this earth, things fall apart. That life is like a vapor, and that history is cyclical, that seasons repeat in a cycle, that civilizations rise and fall, and new ones take their place, and the pattern repeats. And even human life and our human bodies is one that's cyclical. We have a spring, we have a summer, we have a fall, and then we get to the winter of our lives. Things fall apart. And as we look at the world today, it kind of does seem like things are falling apart. Just in the last 5-10 years, we've seen a steep decline in global democracy. We've seen most countries, including two of the biggest economies, Germany and China, in recession. We've seen polarized elections all around the world. We've seen the physical, physiological, psychological, sociological, economical effects of the COVID pandemic still affecting us. In the United States, a recent Gallup survey shows that public confidence in the Supreme Court, in banks, in public schools, in the presidency, in large technology companies, and organized labor is at 25%. For newspapers, our criminal justice system, television news, and big business, it's at 20%. For Congress, it's at 8%. Trust in institutions today is half of what it was in 1979, which was already a period of declining belief in institutions because of the Watergate scandal. Institutional trust in our society is collapsing. And none of what I'm saying is political. It's just something that is greater than politics. Our young people, Gen Z, the kids that are here, they have never grown up in an era where institutions were strong and trustworthy. We are seeing a widespread decline in trust in our society, and it is something that is affecting many, many sectors. There is a question about the trustworthiness of tech companies, Wall Street, the healthcare system, the military, which some people feel has become too woke or has become too big. Even sports leagues today, FIFA is a scandalous organization. Some people say the NBA is rigged. The NFL went woke. Major League Baseball, declining attendance and lots of gambling. The Olympic Committee, letting people cheat and get away with it. Even global organizations that most of us grew up respecting, like the United Nations or NATO, are fragile. The World Health Organization is not as trusted as it was. Our global currencies, the dollar, the euro, the yen, none of them are truly a safe haven. That's why we're seeing the rise of cryptocurrencies and gold. Climate change, is it real or not? And then religion, is the institutional church dying? Are denominations going to continue splitting and closing? It certainly looks like things fall apart. And this isn't just me cherry picking, trying to find things that are not going well. No, this is actually a pattern in history. There's a pattern in which periods of high trust in high trust in society and strong institutions are followed by a period of high trust and weakening institutions. That's then followed by a period of low societal trust and weakening institutions. And then that's followed by the moment that we're in, a collapse in societal trust and the institutions all at the same time, and a sense that we're going to have to completely reinvent them and create a new order. And that's the period we're in now. And it's this generation that's going to do it. This generation in our church. Generation Z, Generation Alpha, they are the ones who are going to reinvent what we feel is breaking apart. It becomes a pervasive distrust, a visible breakdown, a falling apart that is clear to all. Everyone becomes cynical and suspicious. Will the next U.S. president be honored no matter who wins? Does anyone at this point think tech companies have our best interest at heart? Or are we just all algorithms that they're measuring, perpetually trying to monetize us? Are the courts the same for the wealthy as they are for the poor? Are universities going to be trusted after they have hiked tuition 500% over the price of inflation over the last 30 years? What about Wall Street? Wall Street's financial instruments, are they trustworthy? When trading is done by high-powered computers and algorithms that no individual trader can compete with, is your money safe? Will AI interrupt our public education system? Can you trust flying on a Boeing airplane anymore? Is there any car manufacturer that's seriously making cars that are meant to last? And who is the bad guy and the good guy in the situation with the Middle East and Israel and Palestine? Will Christian denominations grow and become strong, or will they continue to be divided? Is the cost of health care for the average person sustainable? And can you even trust that your HMO is going to cover you when you have a medical ailment that you've been paying for? What about your car insurance company? What about if you're a property owner in Florida? Can you trust the price at the grocery store? Is the FDA really regulating our food and our meat? Which banks are truly FDIC insured? Which major global banks are actually solvent versus what they say they are? Is the Republican Party finished? Is the Democratic Party finished? Is democracy in the United States finished? Things that we once took for granted, and now suddenly we do not have certainty about them. It seems unusual. It seems like things have never been worse than this moment. But what does the Bible say? And specifically, what does Koheleth say, the teacher in Ecclesiastes? What does he say about troubled times? A lot of evangelical Christians, they jump to the conclusion, oh, things are bad, this must be the end times. If I had $1 for every time I've heard that throughout my whole life, I'd be very, very rich. There are always things that people think are signs of the end times. But Ecclesiastes gives us a different perspective. And the first point that these scriptures that we read point to is that human history is cyclical. Human history is cyclical. Verse 4 says, a generation comes and a generation goes. It's the other way around. A generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. You see, the ancients took generations very, very seriously. And that's one of the reasons you have so many genealogies in the Bible, which to us look kind of out of place and irrelevant and boring. And why would you put genealogies in something like the Bible? We talked about this in Sunday school a few months ago. But overall, they understood that generations have a way of relating to each other. One generation builds something, the next generation modifies it, the next generation challenges it and rebels against it, and the next generation destroys it. And then the next generation rebuilds it, and it all starts over again in cycles. So what we think is new and shocking is actually very, very old. Socrates, who died about 4 centuries before Christ, said this. This is what he said. The children now love luxury. They have bad manners. They have contempt for authority. They show disrespect to their elders. That's 4 centuries before Jesus. Peter the Hermit, the Roman Catholic priest born in 1050 AD, in Amiens, France, he said this: the young people today think of nothing but themselves. They have no reverence for their parents or old age. They're impatient of all restraint, and they talk as if they know everything. Professor George T.W. Patrick of the University of Iowa saw an inscription at an old stone museum in Constantinople back in 1913, and he published that inscription in Popular Science Monthly magazine. And the inscription was from the year 3800 BC. 3800 BC. And this is what that inscription said: we have fallen upon evil times, and the world has waxed very old and wicked. And politics are very corrupt. And children are no longer respectful to their parents. Verse 4 says, a generation goes and a generation comes, but the earth remains forever. Verse 6 in Ecclesiastes chapter 1 says, the wind blows to the south and goes around to the north. Around and around goes the wind, and on its circuits the wind returns. The wind goes around and around, is what Koheleth says. Circular, cyclical, circular, cyclical. And by the reason he says that the wind goes from north to south instead of what we think, which is from west to east with the jet stream. The reason he says that is because in Palestine, it actually is the case that the airflow goes from the north to the south, unlike it does here. But it's all cyclical, he says, like planting, harvesting, hunting, feasting, gestating, birthing, dying. Verse 8 continues, the eye is not satisfied with seeing. That's an interesting one. Nor the ear filled with hearing. How many hours have we spent looking at screens this week? And is it ever enough? If you were to count your phone, your work computer, streaming videos, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, is it ever enough? Apparently, teenagers now spend 9 hours a week scrolling, just scrolling. Adults are not much better. We spend 3 hours a week just scrolling on the internet. Ecclesiastes tells us the eye is not satisfied with seeing. Verse 9 says, what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. Nothing new under the sun. But everything seems so different now. Everything seems so wrong now. Like, oh, this is the worst time in our country's history. Well, this is not the first time that democracy has been challenged or struggled to survive. In fact, it was the same situation in the 1770s and the 1780s. It happened again in the 1860s. It happened in the 30s and 40s. And each time that this happened, there were controversies over too much immigration, too much random crime, overinflated stock markets, disruptions from new technology, and the need for more than two political parties. Even in the 1920s, gender fluidity was an issue. Back in the 1920s. Culture wars raged, political discourse coarsened, politicians grew more rude, nationalism grew, the nation developed a substance problems with opiates. Sometimes it was actual opium, sometimes it was alcohol. Today it's meth and OxyContin. Verse 9 of Ecclesiastes 1 tells us what has been is what will be, and what has been done is what will be done, and there is nothing new under the sun. It is correct. Verse 10 says, is there a thing of which it is said, see, this is new? It has already been done in the ages before us. I was taught growing up that Christopher Columbus discovered America. But then later I was taught that actually the Vikings discovered America. Back in around 800 AD, Leif Erikson came over with the Vikings to what is eastern Canada, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, and they have found ancient Viking coins as far south as Maine. But then later I learned that even before Christopher Columbus, the Chinese sailor Zhang He went all the way from China to Kenya and even brought back giraffes from Kenya because his ships were far, far bigger and more sophisticated than those of Columbus and the European explorers, although we never learned that in the history books. It's amazing. But most countries and all civilizations agree with Ecclesiastes. They understand that the world is cyclical. They understand that things are falling apart. The Mayans, the Aztecs, the Hindus, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans had a humility that was required to internalize. There have been ages before us and there will be ages after us. Americans struggle with this, and the number one reason they struggle with this is because their history is only 200 years old, and it has been almost nonstop success. 200 years old. That is a very, very, very small amount of time. The ceiling on the bedroom that Jamie and I had in Italy, the ceiling of our bedroom was older than the United States. The church that was next door to us was twice as old as the United States. Mozart actually performed his first concert in Italy there when he was 6 years old. And then, of course, Chinese history is much, much older than the United States. And the longer your civilization has a history, the longer you see what Ecclesiastes is saying. Human history is cyclical. But the second point this morning is not just that it's cyclical, but that things fall apart. Things fall apart. Ancient civilizations like Egypt, which is 20 times older than the United States. The Incas, the Mayans, the Aztecs, the Greeks, the Romans, the Persians, they all knew that societies fall apart. Russia has spent 1,000 years fearing that it's falling apart, and it usually is, and it's falling apart right now. In fact, the Russian mind is always conscious of the fact that it's just one step away from total annihilation. But that's not the way Americans think. But right now, Americans are less worried and less confident. Surveys show that a large majority of Americans are worried about a civil war, a second American Civil War. And there recently was a movie by Alex Garland that came out called Civil War. And it's probably streaming on one of those shows. And it shows you what a modern day civil war in the United States would look like. and it's a scary movie. But empires fall apart, governments fall apart, our bodies fall apart. Mementi mori, that was a saying. Tertullian, the Christian, tells us that Roman generals would ride their chariots in triumph in great processions in Rome after great victories. Into the heart of the Rome they would go as everybody cheered them on. But next to them was an assistant on the chariot whispering into their ear. And he would say to them, as all the people are cheering, memento mori, memento mori. What does that mean? It means remember that you will die. Remember that you will die. Marcus Aurelius said, consider how ephemeral and mean all mortal things are. Psalm 90, verse 12 says, so teach us the numbers of our days, that we may get a heart of wisdom. In other words, Psalm 90 is saying, understand your mortality. Know how limited your time is in this life, so that we might spend our time doing productive things instead of mindless superficialities, like scrolling, which I admit I do and get stuck doing, but I fight it. Psalm 39, verse 5 says, behold, you have made my days a few handbreadths, and my lifetime is as nothing before you. Surely all mankind stands as a mere breath. Surely a man goes about as a shadow. And here it echoes Ecclesiastes. We are mere breath. Our days will vanish like a breath. Isaiah chapter 40, verse 7 tells us, the grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows on it. Surely the people are grass. I like the contemporary English version better. What it says is this, at the Lord's command, flowers and grass disappear, and so do we. James, in the New Testament, in chapter 4, verses 14, says, you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? For you are a mist, once again, a vapor that appears for a little time and then vanishes. So what Ecclesiastes is trying to teach us here is humility and perspective. Humility, that we're not as in control as we think we are. And our societies are not as anti-fragile as we think they are. They are, in fact, vulnerable. Ecclesiastes chapter 7, verse 2 changes the paradigm. It says, it is better to go to the house of mourning than to go to the house of feasting. For this is the end of all mankind, and the living will lay it to heart. Ecclesiastes 7, verse 29 says, I found that God made man upright, but they have sought out many schemes. Now, the story that we're looking at in the youth group is Genesis chapter 3, and we're taking quite a while to go through it because it's a very key moment in the life of the world that God created. It looks like a very simplistic story. It looks like a cartoon story. A lot of that has to do with its Hebrew literary style. But these first opening chapters of Genesis are incredibly complex. They are not just about creation. They are about a multiple level of things. And in fact, I would say there's probably been no written text that has ever been more written about since it was written than these opening chapters of Genesis. They are incredibly deep. They are incredibly complicated. And one of the things Genesis 3 is recording is the fact that human beings on their own set in motion this endless cycle of rise and collapse, corruption and self-destruction. They're introduced into Eden till ultimately they go east of Eden. From here on out, because of disobedience of the human heart, things fall apart. Not because God wanted them to, but because humans decided to live apart from God's wisdom and his friendship. The Bible doesn't mince words about things falling apart. In fact, we don't even make it 4 chapters into the Bible before we have our first murder. That's not too good of a track record. 4 chapters. And in that 4th chapter, it's a sibling versus a sibling. So we have not only murder, but family conflict. And we see both those behaviors, both those themes repeated for the rest of the Bible. Dysfunctional families and violence, a cyclical theme in the Bible. So this is an endless cycle of suffering and mistakes that go on. And this is why Hinduism and Buddhism are trying to describe the futility of life, because we can't escape these things. We're trapped in this endless loop. And so things are falling apart even in their point of view. And Ecclesiastes is even using some language that sounds Buddhist. Things are meaningless. All vanity is vapor. Life is a disappearing mist. Now, the answer in the Eastern religions is to withdraw from the world. We can't solve the problem, so we withdraw from the world so that we're not conscious and participating in it, or we don't care if we are. It's about detachment. It's about accepting nothingness. But the Bible, and this is the key thing, the Bible does something different. It produces an exit plan. It produces a way out of this endless loop of negativity. It gives us hope. Because there's an alternate pattern that it creates. Simply put, God, through Christ Jesus, is in the process of creating a different track, a non-linear cyclical track, one in which society and history may be trapped in cycles and fall apart, and we have death and we have all these other things, but there's a way out. There's a way out. And as bad as the book of Genesis is, with its violence, its betrayals, its families fighting, its lies, and of course the snake and its deception, as bad as Genesis is, pointing out that sad cycle, it begins immediately to construct an exit out of that cycle. And that's one of the most beautiful, amazing things about Genesis. In Genesis, it says that if they eat the fruit, you will surely die. But that's the first glimpse of God's grace, because they don't die. Yes, a negative cycle has been set in motion, but God's redemption plan starts already at that moment. In Genesis, there's this Ecclesiastes-like proclamation by the snake that eating the fruit from the wrong tree will lead to death. This is not a story about reptiles and produce, snakes and apples, or something like that. Of course, there's not even an apple in Genesis. This is about a sinful track of destruction being created when we choose to ignore God. And the snake convinces us that we can live without God. But already with the first murder, God begins a new trajectory, the new path of grace. He punishes Cain, but he puts a mark on his forehead. But he does not do this to label him a murderer, but to protect him from being killed. He is protecting him. Paradise is lost, but already in Genesis, we are seeing the seeds and the signs of grace. And the rest of Genesis shows us things falling apart, things falling apart, things falling apart. Problems with Noah, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. But then we get to Joseph, and then that is a different story. We have all this blood and gore and tragedy in the Bible, and one of the reasons the Bible has so much gore and difficult moments and darkness in it is because it is showing us the consequences of track one. the one where God is excluded, where there's no grace. The Ecclesiastes version. But it also starts setting the stage for a new Adam, who will be Jesus Christ. Paul talks about how things fall apart and are stuck in a doom loop because of the self-destructiveness of man. But Adam is one of several words for man that is referring to humanity, man as a species. And in Romans chapter 5, verse 15, Paul presents Christ as the antitype of Adam. Adam's the first man of old creation. Jesus is the first man of new creations. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 45 through 50. Adam is unfaithful and ushers in the cycle of things falling apart. Jesus, through his obedience and sacrifice, ushers in an eternal cycle of forgiveness and grace. This is an ancient rhetorical device in this kind of Near Eastern literature that's called syncresis. The differences and similarities in Adam versus Jesus. And so between rebellion and obedience, between despair and hope, destroying and rebuilding, the most important thing of all is that we see a symmetry, that God is correcting the tragedy. Romans 5, verses 12 through 21, has a section that says, as sin resigned in death, grace also might reign through righteousness, leading to eternal life through Jesus Christ our Lord. So there we see Paul referring to this second grace track, the road to redemption. Now, when the Bible's doing this, Adam's mistake is getting corrected along the way until we get to the story of Joseph. Now, you may notice that the story of Joseph is very different than the rest of the stories in Genesis. It has a coherence to it. It has a novel-like way of presenting itself. Why is that? Because after all these kind of disturbing stories and confusing stories in Genesis, we have the story of one man who is trying to be faithful, who is trying to listen to God, who is persecuted by his own people and left for dead, who is imprisoned, and who then rises, gets recognized as a king, and people bow down to him. Who does that sound like? So even by the end of the book of Genesis, we have a mini version of the life of Jesus. That's a beautiful, beautiful symmetry. The road to redemption, grace. This is where the future is headed. This is what the other religions do not offer. And that's really, really important to understand. They don't offer that second track. They don't offer that beautiful resurrection, love, grace story. It's completely absent in every other religion. Genesis is a book that we sell short because we think it's about one thing, that it's only creation. But what it is, it's a book of incredible honesty and incredible hope. Honesty because it portrays a lot of darkness as the consequence of humans breaking away from God. It portrays God as very accessible, walking in the garden. That's key because gods in the ancient days did not walk in gardens. They did not walk with people. They hated people. People were their slaves. They could eat people if they wanted to. They could kill people. They certainly did not walk in the garden with people. And they certainly did not consider people a product of their image. Yet that's exactly what we see at the very, very beginning of Genesis. And it's going to give us more grace pictures all the way through until we get to that beautiful, fleshed out, perfect narrative arc of the story of Joseph, a prototype for Jesus and a prototype for grace. And he kind of even refers to that second track, that second option that God has created of grace. When he says, you know, what the world and everything planned for bad, God has made for good. There it is right there. In other words, things have been very bad and rebellious and dark, but through it all, God had a plan, and it will come to fruition. And my story, the story of Joseph, is proof. And the rest of the Bible is trying to illustrate that. So what does that mean for us today? What does that mean for us today when we look at the news? It means that the key to escaping all of this negativity, and that's the third point, is the new Adam, Jesus Christ. That's the key. That's the key, to understand that he is the way out of what you see in the world, because he promises a renewal of the world, because he gives you the Holy Spirit who inhabits in your body to help you deal with the challenges of the world. Because he is the one in charge of history, and no power in the world, whether it's Russia or the United States or terrorists, is bigger than Jesus Christ. So as Christians, we should be people of hope even in the darkest times. I hear a lot of Christians nowadays very negative about if their candidate loses, or very negative about if a war breaks out, or very negative about this or that. And yes, those are all tragedies and consequences of sin. But the beautiful thing is that as Christians, we are not bound to that cycle that the world is trapped in, and will be trapped in after we're gone. Things fall apart in this world. But Ecclesiastes is teaching us that it's a waste of time to put our hope in material success. We're invited to supersede that. We're invited to be a light and the salt of the earth, to not get caught up in these temporal battles, which we're not even going to be around that much longer for them. One day, America probably will collapse, as all empires and countries do. Ecclesiastes would say, well, maybe it'll be tomorrow, maybe in 1,000 years from now, but it'll happen because there's nothing new under the sun. But the book of Ecclesiastes ends with a belief that we must trust God and that he will provide. It's interesting because a lot of Bible scholars, and many of them are not Christian, a large amount of top Bible scholars are not Christians at all. And that's okay, because they can flesh out some very interesting things from the text, and they do a lot of great research, and it's good to be familiar with them and not be threatened by them and be insecure and all of that. But they always kind of want to make the Bible more simple than it is. And so in Ecclesiastes, we have this book that is so negative, almost nihilistic, almost more of a Buddhist book or a Hindu book than a Christian book. But at the very, very end, after you've gone through all this negativity, we get to the end, and verse 12, verse 13, it has this sudden conclusion. The end of the matter, all has been heard. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. For God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. Now, the scholars, this is what they want to say. They want to say, oh, this book really didn't fit in the Bible, and it's such a negative book that later on, after the book was produced, someone added these 2 sentences here. They put that in later just to make it happy ending. we needed a Hollywood ending, so someone went in there and wrote the holiday ending. I completely disagree. I completely disagree because Ecclesiastes, I believe, knows that we don't take the cycles of history seriously. And that we need to know that because of sin, we are trapped in some of these cycles. And so I think the punch, the beautiful literary work, the smart decision by the author is that at the very, very, very end, after all of this negativity, he gets right to the point. And that's how he closes the book. Bottom line is don't fear all these things. Fear God. Keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man. And then he reassures us, for God will bring every deed into judgment with every secret thing, whether good or evil. In other words, it's not a mistake how Ecclesiastes ends. It's not a late addition by some guy who needed a Disney ending. No, it's a punch in the face. It's a punch in the face. As negative as things can be, as bad as that first cycle is, there is a way out. And it's that second cycle. That second cycle that tells us to focus on serving God. So there's nothing new under our temporal sun. We're told that even now by scientists, we're told that the sun is in the process of dying, and one day it's going to die. But it is the sun, S-O-N, that creates that second track, a different trajectory, one that creates ultimate and eternal immunity from the entropy that we experience. So I invite you this week to reflect on this fact, that this world is not all there is. You will rise yourselves like the sun. Not S-U-N, but S-O-N. Not like S-U-N, the flame in the sky that will one day die out, but like the S-O-N, who is eternal. Let not your heart be troubled, neither let it be afraid. Amen.